continue the debate with second speeches, one by each side. These speeches are for a period of 5 minutes. We will start with the affirmative, and the affirmative may begin.
Okay. So it's first important to understand why we need to look at just war theory as a whole rather than just the proportionality. You know, a wise man once told me to take an ecumenical view of the world by looking at all of the facets of the diamond. And when looking towards war, there's really 6 facets, so it's kind of like a cube-shaped diamond, in that we have to look to different aspects of the war rather than just this one. Because while the costs may outweigh the benefits or vice versa, NATO may not have been able to be there in the first place without a real cause, and if the war is not winnable, for example, then there's no reason why bloodshed and ethical consequences of an invasion should occur. But we'll go over this more specifically when we talk about each individual tenet. But furthermore, they talk about how they only have to prove individual military operations are justified, but they have to prove that these military operations as a whole are justified, so to basically prove that the war itself is justified. But when talking about military operations, Professor Richard Armstrong defines these military operations as coordinated military actions of a state in response to a developing situation. This means that when they talk about gains through humanitarian aid, through the creation of the Bonn Agreement and the Afghan Constitution, they don't actually apply to this resolution because they have nothing to do with the actual military substance of the war. But first, look to the legitimate authority argument. They argued that we're benefiting the interest of countries abroad by invading Afghanistan, and that it was a consensus vote. But one of the problems is that there's no burden sharing involved in this war, and that NATO countries are backing away from using their troops, and in essence are creating a fragile and fragmented association of NATO states. And because their purpose is a collective self-defense, in the future this could be problematic in that if countries don't want to devote troops and fighting to a collective self-defense, then the alliance can't work. But furthermore, as we pointed out, what's critical to note is that NATO's purpose is as one of a collective self-defense in that they were created to attack Russia and the Warsaw Pact, not for humanitarianism, which means they're outstepping their bounds by helping in humanitarian ways. But second, you have to look at unjust cause. While they talk about the success of counterinsurgency operations, what they don't point out is that we still didn't have a just cause to go into Afghanistan, considering that the attacks weren't even planned there. Most of al-Qaeda operatives are in Pakistan rather than Afghanistan, and none of the actual terrorists were even Afghans. Furthermore, they don't show why we were able to overthrow the Taliban government, considering that they didn't have a good relationship with al-Qaeda. And when they talk about the success of a counterinsurgency operation, one of the problems, as Liddell Hart points out in his book Strategy, the Indirect Approach, is that once a war becomes dispersed and decentralized, the irregular nature of this kind of guerrilla warfare provides a decisive counter to the military strength of an organization such as NATO. Then they continue to talk about the issue of last resort. But an issue of last resort is extremely important in that if the war is not a last resort and there are other options to remedy the situation, the war should not be the policy option that should be actually allocated by the NATO operations, simply because war has a lot of consequences, including bloodshed, the justification of future military invasions, and the ethical consequences that we talk throughout this roundabout. They then go on to talk about how it distracts from the desirability of NATO operations, but they aren't desirable if there are other opportunities and more beneficial opportunities to stop these problems. And while they talk about how the Taliban's attempts at diplomacy were well-timed, they actually agreed to give us Osama bin Laden before we attacked them if we showed any evidence, but we didn't do so. They then go on to talk about how they stabilized the northern and western provinces, but still the rural areas of Afghanistan have been left open to corruption and safe havens of Afghanistan, and more importantly, the Taliban and al-Qaeda have been pushed into Pakistan, where they could potentially be much more dangerous and be safer. They then talk about the 2012 U.S. budget, but as we know, that doesn't exist yet. In fact, the 2011 one was just approved last night. Then they talk about how PRTs and NGOs are helping with oversight and reconstruction, but not only is this not a military operation, but this isn't NATO. They're NGOs, and NATO has actually gotten in the way of these NGOs. Then they talk about how drones are actually helping the war effort. But as Philip Alston, a professor of law at a prestigious institution pretty close to here, I think it's called New York University, describes that drones were actually used because they're much more accurate than other weapons, but the problem is that we don't plan these attacks well enough to where we're only killing 1 terrorist for every 20 civilians that die due to drone strikes, meaning that we're not avoiding the civilian casualties that we could. Furthermore, they talk about how we're resolving government corruption, but there's no empirical evidence of this, considering Afghanistan still has one of the most 3 corrupt governments in the world, according to Transparency International's 2011 report. Finally, they talk about withdrawal, but what we have to remember is that withdrawal has to happen at some point, otherwise we're approaching neo-imperialism. And as we point out, because of all, what we need to do is have a high standard of justice, seeing as though if we have a lower bar of justice, this will make it easier to justify future invasions and create a slippery slope in which this neo-imperialism can be continued by governments and associations such as NATO. And so for these reasons, we urge an affirmative ballot.
Thank you very much. That concludes the first and second speeches. We'll enter an extensive period now of cross-examination. We'll start that process by having the second negative speech is what we will do. I cut him off. I'm sorry. We will have the second speech.
Sorry, is it 5 or 8?
Negative. Go right ahead.
Is it 5 or 8?
It's 5 minutes. I do know that.
Okay. We'll begin this debate with the question of the framework. The affirmative says that we have to prove that all of these tenets are unjustified, but this makes for an unreciprocal debate in which the affirmative can focus on a single tenet that they feel we're weakest on. While it is nice to view the diamond prism of all perspectives, we do need to create some sense of equity in this debate. Additionally, on the fact that NATO is not humanitarian assistance, the coin strategy in Afghanistan of nation building is one premised largely on humanitarian assistance. The military operations there are not just one of combat, but one in order to promote the political transformation of Afghanistan, in which Taliban and al-Qaeda insurgents cannot re-intervene in Afghanistan because of the political environment and because of the population support. NATO even defines these operations as part of its military presence, so we need to look at the actual goal of NATO operations instead of just a small facet of it. Additionally, they say that NATO is fragmented, but all of their decisions are reached on a consensus vote, which means that a decision will not be reached until every single country agrees on it. So there's really no risk of these fissures happening. Additionally, NATO is not overstretching its boundaries by working in Afghanistan. There's no reason we need a new security alliance for every possible security threat that erodes. NATO has changed its definition of what it does in Afghanistan since the Cold War. It is no longer the Cold War alliance that we know and love. It's also one in Afghanistan. Additionally, they say that most of these terrorists are in Pakistan, but and Taliban was a safe haven for al-Qaeda. If we allow immediate withdrawal for now, Afghanistan could once again be a safe haven for al-Qaeda and a plotting ground for more attacks like September 11th. So we need to prevent the rise of power in Afghanistan because of those terrorist threats could once again reemerge in there. And then also onto the tenet of the last resort. This tenet does not answer the resolutional question. While it is a part of just war theory, we need to focus on current operations because what is past is past. There are no limits on how many other possible solutions the affirmative could provide that may have worked that are all speculative. These aren't grounded in reality, so we shouldn't evaluate this tenet as a primary concern. Additionally, the fact the Taliban bombed and, and it was a last resort in 2003 because the U.S. abandoned Afghanistan to go in Iraq. Okay, and on to the fact the war is winnable. The task force solves a lot of the reasons that there are corruption in Afghanistan. It tracks all of the government funds, such as the misallocation of any funds that would go for opium, legitimacy questions, nepotism, misallocation of funds, and stops those funding so the military no longer funds them. Their evidence isn't recent enough to assume the 2010 task force. And additionally, they say there's no budget, but Hillary Clinton is pushing for this budget, and all of the evidence indicates that it will likely be included because there is a strong political support behind of it. And they say that NATO prevents NGOs for humanitarian assistance. This is totally contrary to the truth. As a matter of fact, NGOs need the physical protection of of combat operations. This is seen in Iraq. When combat troops withdrew, PRTs and NGOs were forced to leave the country as a result because they didn't have the protection from the Taliban and aid infrastructure. This means that Afghanistan would be left without water infrastructure, humanitarian assistance, basic education, health care, all of this infrastructure that prevents the collapse of Pakistan. Again, our Stephen Wolf evidence, who's a post-conflict reconstruction expert, indicates that when these forces aren't protected by combat troops, there's likely civil unrest in Afghanistan, independent of the Taliban because of factional tensions, because of poverty. It also causes the government to be perceived as less legitimate because when the people don't have their basic necessities provided for them, they are more likely to side with the insurgency and see that the government isn't providing for them. So this solves for a primary cause of radicalization, as the Goppelman evidence indicates. There are reconstruction efforts. Again, drone strikes have also even if you believe that civilian deaths are the major cause of radicalization, drone strikes have decreased because of our troop evidence, our troop presence. Our evidence post-dates theirs on this question, which means you should refer back to the fact that the troop increases have actually solved a lot of the reasons that NATO operations needed to rely on drone strikes. But additionally, they also decreased the toll on NATO combat operations because there are no longer individual actual fighter pilots in those planes. Additionally, NATO prevents the insurgence of terrorism in Pakistan by eliminating it in Afghanistan. When we solve this perception of the war in Afghanistan, we solve the reasons that extremists are allowed to recruit, because when they're perceived as winning the war, they're less likely also to reconcile with us, but also less likely to more likely to be able to promote extremism globally because they've seen it as a religious victory and they're able to recruit. Our evidence indicates that this is what happened when the USSR withdrew from Afghanistan. It was perceived as an extremist victory, and that laid a lot of the imaginative and recruitment groundwork for 9/11. The fact that we've increased stability, can I finish? Okay. The fact that we've increased stability enough to the point in which the Taliban are willing to reconcile now, and that there is stability in 9 out of 400 provinces, proves that we're making this progress.